So when I was trying to think of or praying and thinking about what to talk about, I'd come up with various different ideas. And then Simon did say, could you talk about something that explains what you do and why you do it and all the rest? So I'm going to talk to you about a very particular story in the Old Testament that I wouldn't mind betting, if I were a betting person, which I'm not, that you haven't heard that many sermons on at all. But before I get there, I actually want to wave a little flyer at you. I'm going to leave some at the back because, Matt, I was listening to your story and I was listening as the ladies talk about Gloucester City Mission and about how hard sometimes that some of us can find Christmas, as it reminds us of the people who aren't with us, the places that we're not, the things that we don't have. Sometimes as everybody else is celebrating amongst the glittery lights and the singing and the everything else, it can feel like quite a tough time. And so Restored, my organisation, is sponsoring a little tour. And we're coming, the closest we are to you is on Friday, I think it's the 12th of December. We're in Stoke Gifford, just this side of Bristol, straight down the motorway, just off. But I'm there with a guy called Patrick Regan, who has created mental wellbeing resources, and Graham Kendrick leading worship. And we're hosting an evening called Bitter and Sweet, looking at how do we do Christmas? How do we find God with us when actually life isn't quite so straightforward? So if that's something that you think you'd enjoy coming along to, or that you know somebody who might really benefit from hearing that, then do come along and join us. I'll leave flyers so that you can book into that. No more promotions, all done. I was told there was a clicker, but there it is. I found it. Okay. So I want us to have a little bit of a look at a story that we find in the book of Judges. And it's a story about a woman who has no name. Well, she probably did have a name, but we're never told what her name is. And it's a story that I'm going to warn you ahead of time is pretty horrible. It's referred to sometimes as one of the tales of terror from the Old Testament. It's a tale of violence. And I just want to acknowledge that for some of us, that's really tough, because we don't like these stories. This is not a story you'll find in children's Bibles for very good reason. And it's a story that might touch on things from our past or things from our present or things that just haunt us. And so if that's the case, I just give you absolute permission to check out and think about something else entirely when we get to some of those bits. And yet it is a story that's in the Bible. And that means it matters. It means it's there for a purpose. And so although it shouldn't be in our children's Bibles, it is something we should look at sometimes and try and understand, what does it tell us about God? And what does it tell us about our relationship with God? And what does it tell us about how we follow God? And where does it go? So we're going to do that. But it also is some story that is quite key to Restored as an organisation and to me. So a little while ago, I went to Bible college and did my master's. And for my dissertation, I focused in on this. And how do you cope with these stories in an age nowadays? But it's ended up feeding into this mission that I won't go into now because I already told you. But this idea of speaking up and doing something, because it comes from a verse that sits at the end of this chapter. So this last verse in the story says, everyone who saw it, and we'll come to that in a moment, was saying to one another, such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt. Just imagine. We must do something. So speak up. And it's that bit there that I've highlighted in yellow. We must do something that's so speak up, that feeds into the mission of everything that we do at Restored. It's quite unusual to start at the end of a story. But I think that this is one of those stories that if it ever got televised, if Netflix decided to make a series out of it, it would be a crime drama. And it would be one of those kind of crime dramas that I think they would start at the end. You know, when they kind of pull everything together and they show you a scene that hooks you right into the story, that leaves you thinking, what on earth has happened here? What is going on? What is this all about? How did this happen? And then they peel back and slowly but surely start to reveal. So in the end we go, oh, I see. I see what happened now. I see what's going on. Because this is an extraordinary moment. And it's interesting. I want to set this story into its kind of historical context. So they're saying such a thing has not been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came out of Egypt. So for those of us who aren't so familiar with the Bible, perhaps church is a bit of a new thing to you, this story is set in time about 3,000 years ago. And where it fits in the whole big arc of the story of the Bible, of God's people, is that it comes after God's people had been kept for, so if we go back even further, there's the story of Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. So for those of us who really don't know a Bible, you will have heard of that story at some point. Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. When Joseph and then his brothers, they all end up living in Egypt, and that's another story for another day. But they live there, and they have children, and they have grandchildren, and the generations come, and the nation of Israel, this people group grows and grows and grows until Egypt, and Pharaoh in particular, begins to see them as a threat. And in another story for another day, the people escape and they go to the promised land. And it takes decades. It's a story for another time. But then they finally reach their promised land. And they enter it under a wonderful leader called Joshua, a man who recognizes God, who knows how to follow him, who leads his people as they learn to love and worship God well. And they take this land and it becomes their home. And the book of Judges starts as Joshua dies. It starts as this people are settled into their land. But as Joshua dies and the generation that saw God take them in begins to move on and get promoted to glory, the people who are left behind slowly but surely forget who God is. And we see the book of Judges, this story of people remembering who God is and forgetting who God is. And then everything goes terribly wrong. So they turn back to God, and it happens again and again and again. And it's like this descent, this spiral into darkness. And you see it politically, economically, religiously, but also in what ends up happening in this story. This story happens at the bottom of all of that. So what is this story? Now, I'm not going to read it to you because it's 30 verses and that's long. But I'm going to tell you the story, and you're free to go away and have a little bit of a read of it. But if we were to jump back a few moments or a day or so before the verse I just read to you, something else extraordinary happened in Israel. Because Israel was separated into 12 people groups, 12 tribes. And each of those tribes received a very disgusting package through the door. Probably not Royal Mail, and probably not with an elastic band. But it was a bloody package. It contained a body part. No wonder they came out and went, "What is going on? We must do something about this." But what's in the box? What's going on? Well, let's zoom right back to the beginning of the story. Because at the beginning of the story, we find the two key characters. The beginning of the chapter tells us that we're looking at a story between a Levite and his concubine. Neither of them actually have names in this picture, in this story. We don't get to know anybody's name at all. We just know that on one hand, we've got a Levite. Now that means that he was a priest. So he's a man. He's a man of high standing, somebody that people would have looked up to, somebody that people would have listened to. They'd have done what he told them to do. They'd have followed him, they'd have obeyed him, and they'd have, lived life the way that he suggested was the right way. So he's an important guy. And on the other hand, you've got his concubine, which is a funny word we don't use so much anymore. But essentially what it is like a secondary wife, a woman who's got all of the responsibilities of being a wife, but very, very few of the rights. And so right before you go any further in this story, you realise you've got a man who's got quite a lot of power. Simon was talking about that a little bit earlier. He's got quite a lot of power, and she really hasn't. There's this great power imbalance before the story even begins, just by realising who these people are. And the story continues, and very swiftly in this story, we see that even though she's not got much power, she makes a massive decision. Because in verse 2, it tells us that she decides to leave him and go back to her father's house. And that's an extraordinary thing. Like in today's world, where we see marriages come and go, and people get divorced and remarried and not even bother getting married, it doesn't seem like such a big deal. But 3,000 years ago, in the Middle East, in the people of God, this was not a normal thing to happen. This was extraordinary. Something big has happened, because the shame attached to this was huge. Extraordinary that her father would have her back. Just unthinkable. And yet he does. And so this woman leaves her husband of sorts, goes back to her father's house, and she's there for a number of months. And then the Bible tells us, and it sounds desperately romantic, depending on your translation, but essentially the original Hebrew says, the Levite decides to win her heart back, which sounds lovely. And so he gets on his donkey, he takes a couple of his servants, and he makes the journey to her father's house. And when he gets there, the Bible tells us, she welcomes him in. And it's the last time, really, that we get to hear her voice. We don't actually hear her voice, but we get to see her do something in her own right. But she welcomes him in and invites him into her father's house. And what happens next is kind of like a protracted session of hospitality. As this guy comes, and apparently he's come to win her heart back, although we never hear him say anything to her, because everything else is between him and her dad. But from that moment on, the dad keeps saying, no, don't go yet. Stay another night. Have another meal. No, stay another night. Have another meal. Until eventually this priest says, no, it's time. It's time for me to take this woman home. It's time for us to leave. We'll set out now. And so they do. I don't know what was going on in the dad's mind. I don't know if he just liked company. I don't know if he was worried about his daughter's well-being. We don't know. The Bible is quite scant in its information sometimes. It leaves stuff for us to interpret and to think through. But the story continues. And this little group now, this Levite, his concubine, the servants and the donkeys start to make their way home. But they don't get there before dark. And nervous of being out in the countryside in the middle of the night, they make it to the nearest Israelite town, a place called Gibeah. And they get to Gibeah and they hang out in the square. And eventually a man comes and says, look, you shouldn't sleep on the streets at night. Maybe he was a forerunner of Gloucester City Mission. But he says, you shouldn't sleep out here on the streets tonight. It's not safe. Come and stay with me. Beautiful hospitality, kindness to strangers. He welcomes them in, and the Levite says, look, we've got our own food. And he says, no, don't worry about that. Come on in, sit down, eat at my table, share with us. It's a story of apparently beautiful kindness to somebody that this man doesn't know. And so they sit down. And the meal is brought out, and they begin to eat, and they have conversations. And then suddenly there's a knocking on the door. And if this was a Netflix series, this is the point at which the music would begin to get tense and it would begin to rise. This is the moment when I'm watching Netflix, when the music begins to do that I go out and have a wee or make a cup of tea, because I don't really like the tension. I don't like those moments when you go, oh, something bad's about to happen, and I don't need to wait for it. I know it's coming. It would have been one of those moments. So the tension's rising, there's this banging on the door, and the host of the house goes to answer it. And true enough, as he opens the door, the Bible tells us that wicked men of the city were standing outside. And they say, send out the Levite because we want to have our way with him. And it's incredibly clear what they want to do with this man. But the host of the house defends him, and he says, absolutely not. Do not do this vile thing. Like, he's really clear in his protection of this man. He says, don't do it. And he calls it out for what it is. He says, this is a vile thing. You mustn't do it. He absolutely condemns it. And you can imagine that if you were those others sitting around that dinner table, that your heart would begin to calm down again, that you'd breathe a little bit more easily, because for a moment there, it looked like something terrible was about to happen. And now you realise that your host has authority and he's protecting you. Until in his very next breath, he says, instead, take this woman, take my daughter and this man's wife, and do whatever seems right in your own eyes. Can you imagine being those women? Can you imagine being his daughter? Can you imagine sitting at that table as it dawns on you, oh, we're not safe. Gosh, our lives don't matter as much as the men's. That's my dad. He thinks I can be sacrificed to save him and this strange man sitting at the table. Can you imagine the thoughts that would have been whirling around their heads at this moment of realizing that their lives simply don't count? Not when there's men to be saved. And actually the daughter is mercifully saved because the Levite stands up and pushes his wife out of the door so fast and closes the door behind her that she is safe. But the Levite's concubine, not so much. And the Bible is mercifully brief in what it says happens, but it's really clear that she's raped and abused all night long, and her body is left for dead on the doorstep in the morning. It's a horrible story. It's a tale of terror. But we haven't got to those body parts in the boxes yet. Because in the morning, the Levite gets up, and I always like to hope that he really slept badly. But again, we don't know. And he gets up to set out home, and he almost trips over this body on the doorstep. And he picks her up, and we're not really sure she's alive or dead at this moment, but she will be soon. And he puts her body over the donkey, and he takes her home, and he cuts her up, and he sends her out to the 12 tribes of Israel. And we get to this moment where the people of God come together in holy outrage and say, what is going on? We must speak up. We must do something. It's a horrible story. There's so much that happens that you can't begin to fathom. Like, what on earth was that about? Taking the body and chopping it up and sending it out. Is he somehow trying to make out that he had nothing to do with this story? That suddenly he's outraged at what's been done to his woman? Who knows? We don't know. But this story sits in the Bible, and it's horrible. And so we don't look at it. But it is there. So what does it tell us, and what does it teach us? Well, the first thing that it teaches us is that God sees these things. Things like this, this is a very public story. But things like this usually happen behind closed doors. They get hushed up, silenced, nobody talks about it. And what this story says is God sees, and he knows, and he cares enough to make sure that this story is in the Bible. But here's the thing, God isn't mentioned in this story. So where is he? What is going on? Does this mean that this is just one of those things and that the Bible is just full of stories of things that just happen in God's kingdom? Well, no. You see, this story is part of a slightly larger story that goes on, but it begins and ends with the same words. In those days, Israel had no king, and they didn't. They didn't have an actual king with a crown. All their people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. They had no king, and they didn't look to the king. I said before that this was a story that sits at the deepest, darkest part of the book of Judges, as God's people have spiraled down and down and down, away from following who God is. This is a story of what happens when God's people turn their back on him. This is a story of what happens in a world where there is no king with a little k or the king with a big K. This is a story of what happens in the world. This is a cautionary tale about keeping Jesus at the centre, about keeping God on his throne and following his ways. And there's another little phrase in here that I think is really important to notice. Because do you remember what I said, the man said to those wicked men of Gibeah? He said, take these women and do what seems right in your own eyes. There's an acknowledgement from him that actually this isn't right in God's eyes. This is what's right in your eyes. This is in a world where you just be you, and you do your truth and I'll do mine, and we'll all just do what seems right for us. And you do what makes you happy. You do that, and there's no moral centre to the world. That's where this story sits. So this isn't a story about how God wants people to be treated. This is about a story about what happens when we stop following God. When the world loses its original pattern. When we lose the blueprint and step outside of it. And it's really easy to go, well, that was a horrible story, but what's it got to do with us? Because golly, weren't they barbaric 3,000 years ago? Weren't they horrible? The things they used to do. And it's really easy even to geographically take ourselves away from it and to go, well, in those parts, some parts of the world today, they're still so misogynistic. The way they treat their women, I'm glad that I live over here. But actually the reality is that this stuff is still happening. And actually the story shows us that this has been going on since almost the dawn of time. And I'm just going to run you through some statistics that are tough statistics, but they're true. So in the last year, globally, more than 9 million girls were forced to have sex. It turns out this woman with no name represents millions of women with no name. whose names we might never know. If we look at it and we take it in a little bit closer still, and we look at domestic abuse, 137 women are killed around the world every single day by men who are meant to love them. Fathers, brothers, husbands, boyfriends. And even closer still, in the UK, it's actually in England and Wales, 2 women a week are killed by somebody who's meant to love them. Oh, that's been crossed out, it's not meant to be. There was a report 4 years ago now, but by the UN Women UK, that looked at it and said, 97% of young women will be sexually harassed. Not might be or could be, but they will be. And that's everything from the wolf whistle as you walk past a building site through to the nastiest, darkest things that happen. It's all of it. But the thing is, women don't know when the whistle's going to turn into the big thing. And so this is the world that we live in. And so this Bible story matters because it tells us God sees, he knows, and he cares. And he knows that it's still going on. Equally, in the same year, 2021, Ofsted did a special review into schools and said that our schools have a rape culture. And what that means is that sexual assault, sexual harassment is so normal that people don't make a fuss. People don't bother to tell anybody. It just carries on. In fact, I did share these statistics at a student conference a couple of years ago. And at the end, a girl came up to talk to me. And she said, Bekah, what's wrong with the 3% of girls who haven't been sexually harassed? And my heart broke a little bit. Because I sat and I thought, well, I'm fairly confident I didn't say this, but I thought it. I thought, I'm fairly confident you're talking about you. And the fact that you think that something's wrong with you because you haven't been sexually harassed is almost a perfect definition of what it means to be in a rape culture. That if I haven't been harassed, if I haven't been made to do something I don't want to do, if I haven't been made to feel uncomfortable, there must be something wrong with me. It doesn't just happen on the other side of the world 3,000 years ago. It's happening much closer to home. And even closer to home, all my lines have gone wiggly woo, it's happening in our churches too. Restore did research a few years ago to try and understand the rates of domestic abuse inside the church. And it's the same as outside the church. 1 in 4 churchgoers has been subjected to domestic abuse at some point in their lifetime. Now, they're not all going to end up dead, but they are being hurt by people who are meant to love them. And so this story really matters, and it challenges us to think about what we can do. What can we do? Does that call of God's people that we looked at the beginning, we must speak up and we must do something, it carries across the ages, across the centuries and the millennia, and says, you must speak up, we must do something. A friend of mine made me a fridge magnet. I must be the only Judges 1930 fridge magnet in the world. But I've got it sitting on a radiator at home. Because it's this call that everything we do at Restored is trying to answer. How do we speak up and do something? And it can look like big things that other people do. This is the vigil on Clapham Common back. It was during COVID and everyone got in trouble for it. But it was after the murder of Sarah Everard. And I don't know if you remember her, but she was a young woman who was just walking home, was the slogan. She was just walking home. And she got kidnapped and killed by a policeman, an off-duty policeman. And everyone came out in holy outrage to say, this just shouldn't be happening. We've got to do something. And here's the thing, she wasn't the first girl who couldn't just walk home. It was a bit like, actually, the story of George Floyd in America. The first time I ever preached on this was just after he'd been murdered. And of course, his murder by a policeman in America kick-started the Black Lives Matter movement. And it was this moment when actually everybody came together and said, we must do something. And you thought, well, George Floyd wasn't the first black man to be murdered by the police in America, and yet something in this story captured everyone's attention. But we don't need to come and join the streets and Clapham Common vigils. It's not very practical for a lot of us, and truthfully, what is required is more than this, because this starts in our hearts and in our minds. It starts with us thinking about how we react and respond to some of these stories, and how we react and respond when we see little things happening around us. Because how different this story could have been. I want to just share, I am going to look at the actual Bible verses with you in just a moment. I'm going to skip through this slide, actually. I'm going to share one of the Bible verses with you. You see, at the start, I told you that she left her husband. And I didn't go into a lot of detail. I just told you it was shocking. But the reason for her leaving is a little bit hard to work out. Because depending on your translation of the Bible, it says some very different things. So if you pick up the NRSV, then it says that she was angry with him and she went to her father's house. If you pick up the NIV, it says she was unfaithful to him and she went to her father's house. But if you pick up the King James Version, she was a whore, which isn't a word I like saying out loud in church. Please let me off that one. It's in the Bible. They're very different versions of the same story, aren't they? You see, if she was angry, then he must have done something that upset her so much that against all the customs of the time, she left him and went back to her husband. But if it's the third one, well, then this turns into a cautionary tale about what happens to bad girls. That's a very different story. And understanding what's going on in the middle of that is really important. Now, here's the thing. I'm not a Hebrew or Greek scholar. I may have studied a bit of theology, but I've had to go to the experts on this one. And the thing is, it's one of those words that doesn't really appear anywhere else, and it's a little bit hard to work out. And what that leaves us with, as we go back and try and understand, is to understand, well, what did they used to say? And if you go back to the earliest church fathers, actually they say she was angry and she left. And it wasn't until the Middle Ages that that word got changed to say that she played the whore. And then she left. And actually, it's in the Middle Ages, there's some of the medieval theologians who said, well, this is a story about divine punishment for women who don't know how to behave. And it's a story, but that translation stuck around for centuries. This is what happens to bad girls. Behave yourselves, women, or else terrible things will happen to you. And I don't know why. I don't know why they did it. I don't know if it was to keep women in their place, or perhaps it's because actually, truthfully, we victim blame people because otherwise the world is too scary to live in. And we do it all the time. Well, if she hadn't have been wearing that skirt, if she hadn't have drunk so much, it wouldn't have happened. And maybe that's true. But it doesn't make it okay that it happened in the first place. It doesn't make it okay. We need to think about our attitudes because our attitudes will frame everything. You see, in this story, we could change this story completely with just some very simple what ifs. What if that Levite had gone to a Bible college? This is a bit anachronistic, so stick with me. What if he'd gone to Bible college and been trained in like what real loving godly marriages look like? What if he'd been taught through Genesis 1 and 2, looking at how men and women are made in both equally in God's image, precious, to be respected, one not better than the other? What if he'd had a very different training? What if culturally those people had continued to follow God and they had raised those men of Gibeah to know how to control themselves, to understand that other people were to be respected, not things to be taken and used for their own satisfaction? What if the man, the host of that house, had understood that the laws of hospitality extend to everybody, not just the men? What if that dad had felt empowered and able to say, do you know what? I don't want her to come home with you. I don't feel that she's safe. I think she's better here. What if? And all of those what ifs are around mindsets. They're about being brave enough to challenge something that seems wrong, brave enough to speak up, to tell a different way. So we're left with a challenge to do something, to speak up in our situations. When we hear conversations in the workplace or in our homes that denigrate women, put people down, denigrate anybody, frankly, will we speak up or do we just keep our mouths quiet? Because we're British, don't you know, and we don't get involved. Or will we say something? Will we say, don't talk about them like that? Or, we'll say, I'm not having part of this conversation. I don't like the way it's going. Gentle challenges. We don't need to start fights. We don't need to make things worse. But could we use our voice to do something? Could we get involved in supporting, Gloucester City Mission as they reach out to those who are vulnerable? Could we reach out to our local refuge and see what they need? I heard yesterday somebody saying that there's only one refuge left in Gloucestershire because funding just disappears. because it's not deemed important enough. Could you reach out and help them? Could you help us at Restored? Maybe. Who knows what it looks like? But could you speak up? Could you do something? I'm just going to give you 3 little ways that you could do that very quickly. You can give to your local refuge, to local services, to whatever's going on. Choose to learn and find out more so that you are able to be part of changing the story, not just be part of it. And you can pray. Praying matters. If you want to pray with Restored, we meet every Monday lunchtime at 1:30 on Zoom, and with some people who keep us going. We always love people to join that, but we send out a prayer newsletter as well, so you can just pray from your homes in your own time too. But I do want to leave you with a challenge to speak up and do something so we can change the story and bring God's kingdom here on earth as it's meant to be in heaven. So let me finish by praying for you guys, and I'll hand back over. Father God, we thank you that things that are not spoken about are still known to you. That you do see what happens behind closed doors and in dark places. You see, you know, you care. Help us to be like you in that. To not just turn and look the other way. To not just think that's too horrible, we can't go there. Or to just wish that it weren't true and pretend that it's not. Help us to notice those who are vulnerable, those who've been harmed, to allow them space to speak their story, to find a place to rest, recover, and flourish as they get to know who you are and how you see them and how you care for them, no matter what has happened in the past. Help this church to be a church that tells a different story, that models a different way of living, that's able to spread your light into the darkness, to be able to change this community so that this community is a safer community than Gibeah was. To teach its young people, its children, its grown-ups, to be ambassadors of light and love in the world around. Father, be with each of us. Help us to hear the challenge when our voice has perhaps not been raised or has joined in at points when it shouldn't. Help us to know there's forgiveness in you and restoration. Amen.